Sunday, Chavches Nisan, Tovshin Ein Gimel. We are in Torah Menachem, Sefer Maamarim, Tovshin Yud Aleph, Tovshin Yud Beis, in the Maamar of Yom Beis Chag Shavuos, Tovshin Yud Aleph, which begins with the words Alpayim Shana Kodem Torah Leberiyasa Shel Olam, and we are on page Tzadik Vov, 2 lines from the bottom, the beginning of the paragraph. We're in the middle of learning about two types of revelation of godliness, and similarly two ways of learning Torah. One is known as Yashar, and one is known as Chayzer, direct light and returning light. In learning, this means that there are two ways of learning. One is learning in a direct way, which means without any questions, without any big discussions, without any big hindrances, but in a more direct way, which is the way of learning Talmud Yerushalmi. And then there is the learning by derech chayzer in a returning way, which means when there are obstacles, when there are questions, when the learning doesn't come easily, and you have to overcome certain things in order to get to the bottom of the material. That's learning b'derech chayzer in a returning way, and that is the mode of learning Talmud Bavli. Now the Rebbe goes on to explain that in the learning of chayzer, which means learning when there are challenges, there are two ways in that itself. Bottom of page Tzadik Vov. In the way of learning, in the way of chayzer, in the returning light way of learning Torah, which means learning when there are challenges and questions and obstacles. In that itself, there are also two modes. The first mode is one toils in his learning in order to understand the material that one is learning. Now, in this way of learning, although there is great toil associated with this type of learning, and the concept of toil, working hard, is not connected to intellectual understanding. Why? Because the idea of seichel, intellect, is from above to below, not from below to above. Meaning to say that toiling is something that it's the person's initiative, it's the haravanya, it's the toil that the person inserts into the process. And that is not the inyan of seichel. Seichel is the idea of understanding the idea, the material, from more in the mode of from above to below, rather than the toil and the energy that the person inserts into the matter. That's number one. And also the essential component, or the essential makeup of toiling is not seichel. That's not intellect. That's the effort, the energy the person puts in, and it must be beyond seichel. Why must it be beyond seichel, beyond intellect? Because it has the ability to assist in the intellect. It assists the intellectual pursuit. It assists the person to understand
the actual effort.
The effort that the person puts in. So Yegia, Horve, the Horven aspect of the learning is not the seichel. It's not the intellect. Nonetheless, in what is he putting in his effort in this particular way of learning? In the pursuit of the material that he's learning, in the pursuit of understanding what he's learning. So that's one way of learning Torah. There are challenges, there are difficulties, and the person invests tremendous effort in order to understand what he's learning. There's another mode of learning. He's learning for the purpose of knowing what he needs to do. One wants to comprehend the divine intention, the divine purpose in how one needs to behave and what one needs to do, which is in the very essence of God Himself. And because of that, he's frightened. He fears that he may not accurately arrive at the accurate conclusion as to what in fact is the Ratzon Elyon, God's divine desire. And because of that, because of that, he's overcome with fear and with trembling, with awe and with fear. And therefore he stands in a mode of contraction, to toil even more, because of the fear that he may not there's a possibility he might not arrive at the proper conclusion in terms of what Hashem wants. Again, the motivation for the toil here is also not the seichel itself at all. What is it? It's the fear of not arriving at the correct conclusion in terms of what is Hashem's will. The Yiras Shamayim is what compels him here. What's the difference? What's the purpose of bringing these 2 points in? Because if you remember, we're talking about Torah as it relates to Tainuk, to pleasure. And the Rebbe enumerated the 5 components that the Pasuk in Mishlei enumerates in association with Torah. The 4 latter, all of which, at least certainly the 4 latter ones, have an element of Tainuk in it. We were talking about Torah at the level of we spoke about Torah at the level of Pnimiyas HaKeser, Atik. We spoke about Torah at the level, we started with the level of Torah as it is in the very essence of Hashem. But then, as it comes into levels, we were talking about Torah as it is at the level of Atik, Torah as it is at the level of Chochmah and Bina, Torah as it is at the level of Midas, Torah as it is at the level of Malchus, and then Torah as it comes down at the level of human beings in our physical world. And in each one of them, there is a component of Tainug. So the question over here is, in this mode of learning, when one learns with toil, in the 2, or when one learns and is motivated because of a fear of not arriving at the correct conclusion, because of his Yiras Shamayim, because he wants to know what Hashem wants him to do we still have an element of Tainug, of pleasure associated with this? Says the Rebbe as follows. It would seem that in the second mode of learning, when one learns for what purpose, for knowing what Hashem wants one to do, and toils in the material, because he's afraid that he might not arrive at the correct conclusion, and not know what Hashem wants him to do, it seems that in this mode of learning, it's not possible for the learning to be a pleasurable learning. The Bishlam Abayfan Aleph, granted, when we talk about the first mode of learning, although he's learning with a great amount of toil, and he is devoted to the learning with his entire essence and his entire being, in ganzen übergegeben, totally given over to the learning, until to such an extent that his life is worthless outside of this endeavor. So you would think that over here, maybe also because of the toil aspect, and because he's so overcome by it, he also can't have pleasure. Says the Rebbe, no. In this mode of learning, which is the first mode in the nonetheless, since why is he toiling? Why is he investing his entire energy and his entire being into this? It's for the purpose of comprehending the seichel, the intellect, the logic, the intellectual pursuit of this learning. It is possible for him to have pleasure in it, because at the end of the day, what's his purpose? His purpose is to understand the material, and that carries with it pleasure. Mashenk and Beifan is not so in the second mode of learning in the form of Heightened. He's not in the mode of seichel at all. His whole being is in a mode of contraction. Why? Because he is overcome with this awe and fear. What I might not. I'm so focused on what I'm learning because I don't want, God forbid, to make a mistake and arrive at a wrong conclusion and do chas v'chalila something that Hashem doesn't want me to do. So that would seem to put the person in the general mode of what? Of verquetschtkeit, of contraction, the opposite of pleasure. Says the Rebbe, even in this mode, there is also an element of tainig. Why? In truth, even in this mode of learning, there is a dimension of pleasure. And the Rebbe gives a mashal. We will understand this from a parable of a minister and a slave who each in turn fulfill the order of the king. The minister has a very good understanding on his own how the king conducts the country in government affairs. He has an understanding in it. And therefore, he fulfills the king's orders also as a result of the minister's love and appreciation for what? For the country and for matters related to government. So the kivan since he knows that fulfilling the king's command is beneficial for the country, therefore he fulfills the command, and therefore he lives. He has life and pleasure in this matter. He's animated in it. He derives pleasure from it. Why? Because he has his independent appreciation of the matter. Mash'en can have it not so when we talk about a slave. Who fulfills the king's command? The slave has no independent existence for himself at all. His entire being is for what purpose? Only to fulfill the king's commands. And he has no understanding in these matters, not in his intellect, and also he has no feeling for it in his emotional in his emotional faculties. Therefore, it would seem that he has no pleasure in this endeavor at all. But really, in truth, we have to say, we're compelled to say that also a slave has at least concealed pleasure, subliminal pleasure, in the fulfillment of the king's command. A proof for this, because we see that the slave has a desire to fulfill the king's command better and more beautiful. He has a desire to do the job well, not just to be yotze, not just to get the job done at the minimum. From this, we're compelled to say, why would he want to do it well? Because he takes pride in it. He has pleasure from it. Because if it was just that he's fulfilling he has a kabbalas oil, he accepts the yoke of the king, and he accepts his slavery to the king, so then he would have to do the minimum, just to fulfill the king's command as much as necessary, and not more. Because the king's command is merely that he should fulfill his will and not more than this. There is no command from the king that he should beautify it and he should fulfill it better than just the bare minimum. From the fact that this particular slave wants to beautify the fulfillment of the command, he wants to do it. He wants to do the job better. This proves that he has at least a subliminal, a hidden pleasure in the fulfillment of the king's command. What is this pleasure that he has? We know that a slave, certainly a slave of Torah, the slave has no independent existence at all. A slave is someone that's completely bottled to the king. So whose pleasure does he have? Says the Rebbe, we could say, it's not his pleasure. His pleasure is actually the king's pleasure. Since the slave has no independent existence at all, he alone is nothing. His entire existence is simply and merely to fulfill the king's will, nothing more. So therefore his pleasure is what? The pleasure of the master. It's actually the pleasure of the king superimposed, which finds expression in what? In the slave. Means to say that the pleasure of the master, that is what is present within him. This is the mashal. What's the nimshal? What's the moral in terms of Torah? We're talking about learning Torah when one learns Torah for the purpose of knowing what one needs to do and is overcome with a tremendous fear and awe of not getting it right, God forbid. So that's like a slave who is completely devoted to the master. Does one have an element of pleasure in there too? Says the Rebbe, yes. This is also in the moral. If somebody learns for the purpose specifically of what? Of knowing what needs to do to fulfill Hashem's will, although his learning and his toil is from a mode, is in a mode of a contraction of the soul, of a kvetchtkeit, nevertheless, really in truth, he has at least a subliminal and hidden pleasure in this process. The adrabah, not only does he have at least a subliminal pleasure, but even more so, in a sense, it's even more powerful than in the other way of learning. Why? Since he himself has no independent benefit from this learning. Why? Because he's learning for one purpose only. To fulfill Hashem's will. So he is bottled. Right? My being now, I'm focused completely on what fulfilling Hashem's will. So what's my entire being now? A being that fulfills Hashem's will. So therefore, Nimtza, what comes out from this, what pleasure does one have in this endeavor? The pleasure from above, God's pleasure. What is felt in him is the pleasure of Hashem, the pleasure of above. Now, in the next ice, just a few words outside before we learn it inside, which we will do tomorrow, please God. The Rebbe is talking about pleasure over here also, but over here we're talking about the essential pleasure. In pleasure you have two types of pleasure. There's a pleasure which is a composite, is made up of other components and finds expression in other things, and then there's pleasure in and of the matter itself that finds expression in the matter itself as well. The former is known as tainug hamurkav v'hamurgash, a composite type of pleasure, and then there's tainug ha'atzmi, essential pleasure, which needs no other component in order to find expression. In Spheris, we're talking about how atik, which is the level of tainug shel maila, Pnimius HaKesed finds expression in Chochmah, or Atik as it is on its own. In its source, on its own. And that one is the highest level of pleasure, the last one, Atik as it is on its own. That is as Torah stands at the level of Atzmus. And that finds expression Dafka where? In the very lowest level, in the learning of the human being down here, and the fulfillment of mitzvahs of the human being down here. We'll learn about that in Mitzvah tomorrow.